Hello and welcome back. I decided to split the mainframe up into two videos. The first video was getting a little bit long. I'm sure by now you've seen it and figured that out. So tonight we're going to start with the next step in the manual, which is the main bearing blocks. This is where some of the new features for Synergy come into play. These are new applications of some existing principles that you've not seen on a Synergy helicopter before. First and foremost, with the increased size, this is a purpose-built 750. This is not a new 700 class. This is a ground-up design for 750 and 800. So we have a 12 millimeter main shaft, and you'll hear later, but the head is also increased to a 10 millimeter spindle. With that, the frame width is wider, so the bearing blocks are larger, but still stuck with 3 bearing blocks, as you can see. Where things get really fun on these bearing blocks is Matt has incorporated thrust bearings into the middle and lower bearing blocks. Now, the purpose for the thrust bearings is actually very much the same as why we have thrust bearings in the head. Radial bearings do a fantastic job of allowing things to rotate and handling forces against their cage. So if the main shaft is here and you cyclic rolls, you're putting a lot of side-to-side pressure on those bearings. They do a great job of handling that. Where radial bearings pick up some extra load and continue to have need for improvement is just as much at play in the main shaft as is in the head. In the main rotor head, we have radial bearings, thrust bearings partnered with radial bearings to help ease that lateral pressure or the in and out force behind the main shaft. Now, the thrust bearings are going to allow as you are loading and unloading the disc, you have to visualize with me, and I'm sure I'm doing a bad job explaining it, but as you are loading and unloading the disc, you are putting pressure on the inner race of this radial bearing. Now, the radial bearing is doing everything it can through the purpose of the cage and the ball assembly to keep things together. And we strategically orient the bearing cups to have those same forces help hold the bearings together as well as strengthen the assembly. Well, by using a thrust bearing and a spacer to connect the inner bearing race on this radial bearing to the inner bearing race on the outer bearing race on the thrust bearing, what you have is when you load the head and the main gear and rotator assembly starts pushing on this radial bearing, that load is then transferred over to this thrust bearing, which is designed to handle it. The bearing surfaces are oriented to handle that pressure coming this way. The reason we have 2 thrust bearings is, these are 3D helicopters. We fly them upside down. When you're loading the disc with positive collective, you're putting pressure on one direction, and when you're loading the disc with negative collective, you're loading the disc the other direction. And while the auto rotation hub is shimmed in and nice and tight, it can't actually move, you are exerting pressure on those bearing races. It's those bearing races that are holding it all tight. So by using thrust bearings, you are going to not only have a smoother drivetrain, you're not going to have those little bit of drag caused by deflecting the radial bearing slightly, but you're also going to increase the life of your bearings significantly. So that's the quick and dirty version of why there are thrust bearings on the main bearings. I personally believe this is something you're going to see on all the big birds very, very soon. I was excited to hear that Matt incorporated that. And then last but not least, the last thing to talk about the main bearings blocks before we actually put them in. On all the previous model Synergy helicopters, there was a collar that went between the swash plate and the upper bearing block to hold the top radial bearing in. With the 766, Matt has gone with retained bearings. So you have these 4 2 millimeter bolts and washers that are actually capturing the outer bearing race, preventing the bearing from coming up through the cup. So there's no need for a collar. So when this is assembled, there will not be a big collar sitting on top of the helicopter. It'll look a little cleaner. It's just a nice added detail. Other than that, you probably recognize the shape. The direct-to-swash servo layout is very much the same. You have upper bearing block. This becomes the middle bearing block, and this becomes the lower bearing block, and your main gear and your auto rotation assembly is sandwiched in between these two. So that's a very familiar setup for the Synergies. A couple of new additions there, everything a little bit bigger and beefier to handle the size. It's going to be great. I'm going to go ahead and stop the video. The instructions have me tearing down the thrust bearings for lubrication. We need to put some Loctite on these bolts holding these bearings in. I want to stop the video, tear the thrust bearings down, take you quickly through the parts inside the thrust bearings, and we'll put it back together. Okay, so I now have my thrust bearings on my main bearing blocks tore down. I've got all the parts laying here. I'm going to run you through them real quick. We're also going to talk about the orientation of these parts. Just like the thrust bearings in the main rotor head, the orientation of the inner and outer races and the cage is very important, so I'm going to take you through that. First and foremost, remember, these are thrust bearings. They do require lubrication. I strongly recommend the good high pressure silicone grease like the Bodo Lube. Triflow makes and a fantastic silicone lube that works here. This is not an application for a lightweight oil. You need a high pressure lubricant silicone here. Oil is just going to spin out and your bearings are going to run dry, and that's a bad idea. I'm a big fan of the Bodo Lube. I've got a couple of tubes that are laying around. Also, the secondary benefit of using the Bodo Lube is there are grease ports in these thrust bearing cups, very similar to the main grips, and you can actually put the needle of the Bodo Lube in there and re-lubricate these thrust bearings without taking them out of the helicopter, which is very handy. Very well thought out. Okay, so let's talk about these thrust bearings. In a rotor head, the thrust bearing is oriented. We're all familiar with thrust bearings, I would think. In a main rotor head, you have the thrust bearings with the outside race, the race with the smaller ID that fits tight on the shaft towards the outside of the head. That's why we call it the outside. And the bearing with the larger ID is slightly loose on the spindle on the inside. Therefore, we call it the inside race. Well, the reason they're oriented that way is in a rotor head, the rotational forces, the inertia is pulling the heads apart. So the area of the thrust bearing that's transferring the rotational force of the spindle is that race closest to the outside. In this application, that's reversed. The load is coming through pressures transferred by the inner bearing race of this radial. So this little brass spacer sits there and it grabs the inside bearing race of the radial. And then the smaller ID, or the traditionally considered outside thrust bearing race, sits on top of that, so that the rotational force that's being applied by that lateral movement of the inner race is directed to the thrust bearing that way. So the instructions call this the inner race, because that's what you're used to thinking of the race that has the smaller inside ID. But it doesn't go on the outside. It doesn't go on the top of the stack. It goes in first, and that's very important. Your thrust bearings are not going to function properly if you don't pay attention to that when you're putting it together. The small ID race goes on the inside, goes on the brass spacer. And I'm going to grab my main shaft out of the box here in a minute and double check which one of these is small ID and the large ID. It's hard to tell by eyesight, but that is very important. So that's going to seem opposite from the blade grips you've built. But just remember, it's the same reason why there's a washer, a shim, between the thrust bearing and the radial bearing in the head. This brass insert is that shim for this design. So shim, inside small ID, cage, packed full of grease, large ID outer race, bearing cap on top. That simple. And then that same philosophy applies to these lower bearing race as well. You have all the same pieces. So I'm going to cut the camera, grab my main shaft, be 120% sure I've got the small ID race on the proper place, and I'm going to get some Loctite for these small screws that hold the bearing caps on, packet full of Bodo Lube, and when we come back, my bearing house assemblies will be ready to put in the helicopter. Okay guys, here we go. All 3 bearing assemblies, all 4 of these bolts on the retainer for the top bearing plate have been removed, Loctite applied and reinserted. The middle bearing thrust bearing assembly has been disassembled, inspected for parts. Orientation of thrust bearing race is correct. Packed generously with Bodo Lube and reassembled. Same as the lower bearing race. These 3 parts are now ready to go into the frames. The next step has us taking these bearing blocks and actually mounting them into the left side frame we've made. So we were going to take a second and pull the bolts out of one side of each of these and start putting them in the frame. Okay, I have all 3 bearing blocks loosely, and you see they move. They are loosely mounted in the frame. We cannot tighten these up until we have the frame halves together, main shaft in place. I'm actually going to take one step further and actually have the main gear auto rotation assembly in place, so I can have the proper shims in the correct locations. So when I tighten up the bearing blocks and tighten up these frame halves, everything is lined up. It's just going to be super square, and the main shaft is going to be properly aligned. The bearings aren't going to be binding, and it's all going to go together very well. All 3 bearing blocks are in. If I do believe correctly, the next step of this is to start prepping the other frame half. And that is correct. So I'm actually not going to bore you with that. The next step is to just take the right side frame half and put the duplicate what we did with the other side. Put the Delrin battery tray in, the quick release, the rear lower standoff, and get it ready to then marry to the frames. So when I come back, we'll be ready to marry the frames, and I'll be talking about what I do to make sure everything is square. See you soon. Okay, so our right side frame half is ready to go. The quick release canopy mount is on, the rear lower side panel standoff is ready, and the Delrin battery tray is in, and I double checked, quadruple checked. In fact, I'm looking again right now to make sure that orientation of that battery tray slide is correct towards the bottom of the frame. So what we're going to do now is we are ready to marry these 2 frame halves together. There's a standoff here. We got to pull the set screw out of this. We need to pull all of these M3 screws all the way around. The M3 screws that go here with the washers are down here, no problem. Pull these M4s. Loosely fit everything together. Grab our Loctite and our 2.5mm wrench, and I'm going to go to my glass tabletop stove. Basically what we're going to do is loosely fit these, set them on a square surface. I have a small square which I will dig out of my box for this, and I will show you when I come back. But I have a small square I used to verify that I am bolting this together square to the flat surface. Then I will tighten up I'll go ahead and tighten up the boom blocks, the frame spacers, the rear carbon. Then I will insert the main shaft and start tightening, and main shaft and auto rotation hub, and tighten up the bearing blocks. That is when I will go bolt by bolt both sides with my Loctite bottle, and all these M3s have to be Loctited. And if you remember, all the M3s on this side, and obviously all the M3s on this side, have no Loctite on them just yet. So a lot will have happened before I get back. I will do a quick recap when I get back. Okay, main frames, both halves are together. All the bolts but the transmission bolts are completely Loctited in. I didn't put the main shaft in after all, the auto rotation hub. I figured worst case scenario, when I go to assemble that and set the mesh, I can always loosen the lower bearing block if I need to adjust the gap a little bit for the shim. No big deal. But as you can see, my main shaft, it drops through the bearing blocks on its own. It doesn't take any effort from me. Those are perfectly aligned, it's butter smooth, and the frame is square. I have a little, I guess it's a 100 by 80 millimeter square, excuse me, that I've been using the square frames against the glass countertop. In my case, I just used my flat top glass stove. Just running that along the frames in various places, against checking for square against the glass top as I tightened everything up and applied Loctite. So there you have it. The bulk of the main frame is assembled. The next step in the manual, I do believe, and let's look. Oh, my tablet's been asleep too long. Hold on. Alright, yeah, the next step in the manual is to put on the anti-rotation bracket, put on, there's another frame spacer that goes up here for support, and then we are into the skids. I am going to stop there tonight, so these two videos combined will be plenty for a one session. I'm going to stop there tonight so I can get everything processed and published, and we can get this day one video up live. Tomorrow we will put the skids on it and move very quickly into the main drive. I fully anticipate getting the main gear, the skids, main gear, motor mount, and probably the swash and head all done tomorrow. Thanks for sticking through it, and we'll see where we go from there.